Perfect. Hello, I'm in a happy position to introduce to you all Mr. William Hummel, who's going to be the best guest speaker for today's event. Mr. Hummel is a partner and NC Board certified specialist in immigration law, working with Garfinkel. Mr. Hummel is also a Davidson alum who graduated from Davidson in 2006, and we're pleased to have him here today talk to us about the legal pathways of a student opening a business in the US. Due to his legal background and high interest in international students in the club, we're also going to cover a few specific issues that concern many international students exploring ways to legally maneuver through the US system. I want to gladly ask you all to place your questions in the chat of this Zoom call, where we're going to try to answer all of them during the Q&A section. Of course, you can then, after in the Q&A section, you can raise your hand and turn on your microphone and ask the question at that time. We encourage all of you to have your cameras turned on for the event, but feel free to turn them off if you don't feel comfortable. Thank you all for your patience. Mr. Hummel, the stage is yours.
All right, thanks, Odysseus, and thanks, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there in person today. The weather seems pleasant, but the roads between, I live in South Charlotte and Davidson, are half are closed or traffic lights are out, so I was hesitant to get up. But yeah, just wanted to, I know I've met some of you all maybe before when I've come up to campus, but obviously here today to talk specifically about setting up your own business and especially those international students and what an investor visa might look like if that's something you want to think about. But then also just in general, even if you're not an international student, what it's sort of some general tips about opening your own business, things to think about. I've got a few things I want to talk about today, but I encourage questions. So please feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your digital hand up, because I think a lot of times questions are useful across other individuals. And we've also got, I know, Sarah from the International Student Office here, who's good because I know some of you have some questions about OPT, and I think the two of us can tackle them together, because I will say, thinking about OPT, there's, and we'll get into it, I've got a couple things I want to talk about. There's some clear guidelines, and then there's a lot of things that are gray in the law, as we say. And so there's, people ask, well, what can I do? And we can talk about, there's things you can try to do, but will the government agree with it after the fact? We don't know. But both of us, we can kind of chime in together and tag team about OPT in particular. But great. And sorry, I had a presentation prepared too, but our office power is out at our office, so we're not able to access our servers. So I can't screen share. But just to sort of walk through some questions I know that you all had in advance. And I think what I'll sort of do is walk through your timeline a little bit, as an international student, and then sort of walking to what you would look like after graduation on OPT, and then we can talk about visas. And Sarah, for you, feel free to chime in if you disagree with me on anything, because again, some of this is gray. So I want to caveat that too, about some of the answers are not clear. So if you ask different lawyers, you may get even different opinions. I'm always creative, but I think, as students, sometimes you want a clear answer. Can I do this and not get in trouble? And I think sometimes the answer is we don't know. There's an argument. But again, feel free to chime in for everybody. So I know first question I often get asked from students very early on is, can I open a business in the US as an international student? And the answer is yes, but then I think it gets into, what do you mean by open a business? Do you mean by open it and you're the legal owner, and then you have someone else run it? Or do you mean open it and you run the business? Because I think, as those of you that are international students know, you cannot work while you're in school off campus, absent OPT or some other special exceptions. So opening the business and running it as a student is not permitted. But if you wanted to open a business and be the owner, sort of like the stockholder, I view that as permissible. Just as like if you were going to own stock in Google or Amazon, you can be the majority shareholder, sole shareholder, but you can't run the business. And one question I often get asked is, well, how do I do that? How do I own the business but not run it? That's not what I want to do. I don't want to give delegation, pay someone else to run it. And I understand all that, but as far as the regulations go, you're not allowed to run it while you're an international student, at least until you're on OPT and further. While you're in school, I always tell students, while you're in school, you really need to be in school. Again, you can be a stockholder in a company. But sort of running the business day to day would have to be delegated to somebody else. Not ideal, I know, but sort of that's just sort of the rules as they exist right now. So that's sort of that first question is, can you open the business? Absolutely, you can open a business, you can be an owner, but can you run it day to day as a student? Short answer is no. Post-graduation on OPT, we'll talk about in a minute, but as a student day to day, you can't be working for your own business in the United States. Cost of opening a business, and this is applicable for everybody. I mean, the short answer is it depends whether you use a lawyer. Do you not use a lawyer? What type of entity you set up? I will say a lot of, especially for startups, you don't have to use a lawyer. There's software like there's LegalZoom that you can sort of, it's almost like a ChatGPT robot, helps you fill out the forms, and then they help you mail it off to the Secretary of State to get incorporated. So if you're just doing that, that's just a couple $100s. If you use a lawyer, you're probably looking at a couple $1,000s with the lawyer to help you set up. Now, sort of, some people ask me, well, should I use a lawyer? Should I not use a lawyer? And again, you don't have to use a lawyer, and especially if I want to set up an LLC, for example, I don't want a corporation. That LegalZoom is very good for if you know what you want to do. But I think once you start to get into those questions about, well, should I set up an LLC for tax purposes? Should I set up an S corporation? Should I set up a partnership? All those are really beyond it. LegalZoom is a robot, so the robot is not really, it cannot give you legal advice. And so that's where I would start to say you may want to get a lawyer involved, or at least a tax professional. And again, you may not need the lawyer for the whole process, just for a consultation. But these are all questions that are good questions when you're opening a business. But you have to think about, because again, there's tax consequences or considerations for the different types of entities. Some are taxed separately from you as an owner. Others, everything is basically comes back to you. So the short answer, the cost is it depends, but it can be very cheap. But the more complicated structure you want to set up, and for tax reasons, awfully, that's what people start to get complicated structures for tax reasons. The more money it can cost. Another question I often get asked is, well, what type of business should I open? This is not really an immigration related issue necessarily, but it also matters for immigration. I always tell people, open a business that you're passionate about. Don't open a business because you think that's what the government wants. And if you have specific ideas, obviously we can talk about it. But also, I will say, whether you're an international student or not, if you're not passionate about what you want to do, I think you'll regret owning your own business and running it. And I do think, especially for the international students, that question will come up eventually when we talk about the investor visa. And if you were to apply for investor visa, they're going to ask you, well, why did you open this business? What about your background? And if your academic background relates, that's great. But if it's also just a passion of yours, you grew up, your family owned this type of business back in your home country, so you have experience, that's all important to know. So I would say, international student or not, you should open a business that you have a passion about. Don't open a IT consulting firm because you think that's what the government wants. No, I think they do look at sort of what are you capable of running, and what do you have a passion about. As far as operational costs and owning your own business, again, this sort of depends on how quickly you grow and what you're planning to do. For those that are international students, to my initial comment, keep in mind that you've got to delegate running the business to somebody else if you're the owner. So you really do have to, and you likely will have to pay that person for doing so. So you're going to have some operational costs that a U.S. citizen owner would not have, just to be frank. Operational costs for everything from your IT, physical space. I think nowadays, and this is our meeting right here is a good example, the physical space is less and less important for visa applications. So if you're an international student, before COVID, physical space was very important in a visa application. If you didn't have an office, the government sort of was disinclined to approve visas, investor visas. Now, telecommuting and telework is possible for visa applications, but you also have to be prepared to still explain, why do you need to be in the United States? That is a common question I see people get asked at visa interviews, is if you're going to be teleworking, okay, great, why do you even need to be in the United States? Why can't you do this from your home country? So you do need to prepare, even if you don't have an office, for an answer to that question, whether it's, well, my clients are in the United States, my customers, my suppliers, whatever it is. But there is often that question about, again, well, if you can do it remotely, why do you even need a visa? Taxes question. There are a couple questions about taxes. I'm not an accountant, so I don't want to get into a lot of that detail. I will say just generally, you always do have to file taxes, even if you're not making money. So even if you're losing money, you have to file the paperwork every year. And so there's a cost in that. There are ways that accountants that you can be you can be not profitable on paper, but profitable in practice. So this is where you get an accountant to help you. And there's reasons why you want to do it. You report a loss on your taxes for credits and for future years. But yet you can still make a profit, at the end of the day in your bank account. But I will say the general rule of thumb is no matter what, even if the business is almost dormant, I would recommend you file taxes every year, file the paperwork just to report the business. You have to, and that is part of a general compliance standard anyway, is again, reporting taxes, even if the income is minimal or if even zero. That's something that you should, in my mind, you should always do, because the government sort of wants, I've seen it on occasion, they come back and say, well, prove to me that you didn't make any money. And sometimes that's a little awkward because you think, well, how do I prove I didn't make money? But the easiest way to do that is to say, well, look, I filed my tax returns and I told you I wasn't making any money. So at least you've told the government, you can point back and say, look, I was declaring every year that this business wasn't, profitable or wasn't operating. Because if not, they could, again, it's rare, but they could say, well, we're worried that you were making money and weren't reporting it. Okay. Before I move specifically onto sort of the OPT and post-OPT option, just want to pause here and see if anyone has any general questions about opening a business or sort of the setup of a business, anything like that.
Thank you.
Hey,
Please speak.
Yep.
You mentioned investor visa. I'm not aware of what that is. Could you explain what that is?
Yep, and that's what I'm going to move on to next. Is sort of an investor visa is a work visa, sort of post OPT.
Perfect.
So we'll talk about that in just a second.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hummel. Could you please elaborate in regards to who specifically do we need to contact as an international student or as a US student to open a business? For example, should we contact you and you file the paperwork for us and we work together, or do we have to go into a specific website to open a business? What specifically do we need to do?
Yeah, good question. So again, you don't have to have a lawyer. In our office, I do immigration work. I don't do business incorporation. So I'm happy to give you names. So if you want a name of a lawyer, feel free to reach out to me and I can give you the names of some lawyers here in North Carolina. But in essence, whether you use a lawyer or whether you do it on your own, the paperwork you submit is to the North Carolina Secretary of State. So if you're setting up a business in North Carolina, and it's true in pretty much every state, there's a Secretary of State or equivalent office that is the state designated office to they register business. So you'd file your paperwork with them. They review it, stamp it of approval. In North Carolina, for example, once you've registered your business, it becomes public record. So I can look up, if it just is set up as business, a week later, I can look that up online and see, then, if I know the name of the business, I can look up the name. I can see who's the registered owner. So in North Carolina, all that's public record. In many states, it's all public record. But into that question, the paperwork you file is with the Secretary of State or the equivalent in the appropriate state. And then they hold it on file. You do also have annual reporting obligations. For example, in North Carolina, you have to file a pretty simple form, but you do have to file a form every year with the Secretary of State confirming, and it's a lot for legal reasons, you have to confirm the address where any legal notices would have to be sent. So it's a very simple form, but it has to be filed every year. And if it's not filed, then the Secretary of State terminates your not your license, but your business registration. And so I have seen that too, where people forget, I forgot to submit. It's a very simple form, but you forget to submit it. And then the North Carolina Secretary of State starts the process of deregistering your business. So it's something, that's what the benefit of a lawyer is, they'll help you remember those sort of every year to submit the form. But in essence, that's where you're going to go. Is the paperwork will go to the the Secretary of State in most states for registration, and then they stamp approval. And once you get it back, then you're legally, the business does exist.
I heard that to open a business and fill out all these documents and whatever money do you need to pay, that only comes up to a cost of $250. Is that correct, or is the
Yeah, so the state fee is very low. So the North Carolina fee to register a business is exactly like it's like just a couple $100. And then if you use LegalZoom, I think they charge a couple $100 in addition. But exactly, the actual filing of the paperwork, the government fee, if you will, to incorporate is exactly, it's like less than $300 in North Carolina, and most states are very low. So a lot of states make it very affordable to incorporate or set up the entity. Again, that's very affordable.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference of opening a business in North Carolina specifically, or versus opening a business in another state?
Yeah, good question. And it's day to day, is there a big difference? No. There's some benefits, and you all probably, especially if you are econ majors, you may know Delaware is a big state for, a lot of the big Fortune 500 companies are set up in Delaware. They do that, number one, because Delaware makes some of the information private. So for example, I cannot look up who owns a business in Delaware if it's incorporated there. Also, Delaware's business courts are more friendly for debtors. If your business got into debt, the Delaware court is a little more friendly to shielding owners from that obligation. Can you set up a North Carolina company and operate in South Carolina or Georgia? Yes. And same, can you legally open your company in Delaware and then operate in North Carolina? Yes. It often goes to a little bit of tax consideration, but then also your liability. Honestly, that's sort of the other thing to think about is, again, Delaware is very big for big companies that want to shield investors from liability. But for most day-to-day people, I think North Carolina would be fine. But it's not required. Again, you don't have to incorporate in North Carolina, even if this is where you want to live.
Well, Mr. William, I have a question. So,
Mhm.
can you give some examples of the business that students have done in the past that could be profitable or not? I was just curious.
I mean, I actually don't know of any specific example. I mean, and it's been almost 20 years, but being a Davidson student is hard. So I don't know how you could be a student and run a business at the same time. I mean, I do know some American students I remember would, especially now with Amazon, sell things via Amazon, online. Obviously tutoring business, that could be something, running a tutoring business could be something if you wanted to do that. But I mean, from a practical perspective, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think I don't know how I could have run a business as a student, as a true student. And again, for international students, remember that you can't work. So I mean, even if you incorporate a business and you own it, you can't do anything for your business. You really are a stockholder. I mean, think of it like that it's no different than you owning stock in Amazon. You get a profit at the end of the year. If there is a profit, but otherwise you're not running the day-to-day of the business. And Sarah, I don't know if you disagree or kind of agree with that, or have any other sort of want to add anything about particularly F1s owning a business while they're in school.
No, I'll echo you on that, Will, and just say, remember that your primary responsibility as students in F1 status and on your F1 visas are your academics and your studies. So I think it's great to be thinking ahead to what you might be interested in doing and kind of building out that foundation. But remember, right now, your priority is your academic course of study.
Great. So, so you do have possibility, but not as a student, but once you graduate, then more doors open, right? So you can have business using OPT or some other measures.
Yeah, so that's a good segue to talk about sort of the pathway. So post and this, I feel like now maybe I'll have Sarah and I will tag team because I want to talk about OPT first. So OPT, I mean, it's great for your international students, especially your first year. It's a great benefit. It's very cost effective compared to some other visa options. And your first year of OPT is very flexible. I mean, you can do, I don't want to say almost anything, but you can do a lot on your first year of OPT. You can be self-employed, you can work, you can volunteer, as long as it relates to your major. I mean, that's important throughout OPT, but your first year of OPT, you've got a lot of options. You can run your own business, you can volunteer, you can do multiple, you can do multiple. It's when, for those of you that are STEM, when you move to STEM OPT, that the rules are, I mean, they are more narrow. Again, there's a little bit of gray area. I'm going to talk about it in a second, but it really, the guidance for STEM OPT does narrow pretty significantly. So working for yourself, being truly self-employed is not an option under STEM OPT. So OPT gives you that option, for the first year, but then STEM OPT starts to narrow it. And then I'll talk about in just a minute the investor visa, because again, if you could move to the investor visa, that again sort of opens the door. And the investor visa, for those that are eligible, really does let you do a lot. But I know there were a couple questions about STEM OPT in particular, and I'll just sort of comment there. Again, there's some gray areas, but what's important for STEM OPT is that, number one, the employer has to be e-verified, so that's always that is a requirement for any employer. Number two, you have to have an employer-employee relationship. And I think this is hard when it is your own business. The idea is that there's somebody there who supervises and controls your work. So when you're the company president, I think there's going to be a question about, well, who's really controlling your work? I've heard some people talk about, well, if I set up a board of directors, that I answer to, will that work? And in theory, you're thinking along the right sort of train of thought, but I still think USCIS would then say, but if your title is president or general manager, you're not a trainee. I mean, because ultimately as OPT, you're here to get training. And I think USCIS could question and say, even though you were reporting to a board of directors, you were not in a position where you were learning and training, you were running the business. And so I think there's a risk there that ultimately USCIS would come back and said, you misused OPT. Because again, that even with the board of directors and sort of having someone to report to, I would be concerned that USCIS would say it's not an OPT position, because they do look at that. You do also have to be paid on OPT. So, you have to pay yourself a regular salary, which is not true on first year OPT. And so having the cash flow to pay yourself a regular salary through your own business could be, especially when you're a startup, sometimes is an issue. And then you also do have to work at least 20 hours a week. I think that's less of a concern. If you're running your own business, you often work more than 40 hours a week. But still, it does have to be at least 20 hours a week. Sarah, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add about STEM OPT.
No, this is great. I'm actually going to get trained on STEM OPT this year. So Sarah and Angie are our office experts on it. So I'll just say, if you do have specific regulations questions that aren't answered today, schedule a meeting with ISC staff.
Okay. So I think, STEM, ultimately, my advice is, I don't want to say it's impossible, but I think it's difficult to run your own business on STEM OPT just because of those requirements. I mean, again, there's some ways you can structure it with a board of directors that might work, but I think there's risk that immigration could look back eventually and say, you misused STEM OPT. And there's, and they've done this, years later, they could look back and say, wait a minute, you should have never gotten STEM OPT. And then they punish you and say, because you misused an immigration benefit, we're not going to allow you to get any other benefit in the future. I mean, so it can be a very harsh punishment. And again, if anyone has specific questions either today or individually, I'm happy to talk to you if you have sort of ideas. But I think I would caution you against STEM OPT just because the rules are fairly rigid, and I think immigration would see behind some of the ways to structure around it. So Odysseus, I know you have a question.
You mentioned that the business needs to be e-verified, which from my small research that I have done is not really particularly difficult, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
I also wanted to ask in regards to, what if I'm not the owner of the business, but let's say my dad is the owner of the business? Could he potentially sponsor my STEM extension, or could another relative sponsor my STEM extension? And would there still be a risk in regards to going back and then punishing me years later for what I had done essentially?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. So in theory, if, you know, let's say it's a business your dad owns, your uncle owns, then obviously you're not the owner, so that avoids one criteria. I think the question still is, what job are you doing? Are you, in essence, are you still running the company? Because if, for example, your uncle is not in the United States and they're delegating everything to you, I think USCS would still say day to day, you're the face of the company. You're, practically speaking, if we walk in, anyone's going to see you as the manager, the owner, the president, even if legally you're not. Now, if your uncle is here in the US on a green card or his own work visa and he hires you into his company, then I think that's different because he's here, he's running the business. But I think, to your point, it depends how it's structured, but I'd be cautious about saying, well, my parents own the business on paper, but they live in my home country and day to day, everything's falling to me. I think immigration would say, well, you're the president in all but name. And so again, that's not a true OPT position.
So it needs to be somebody who is based in the US.
Yeah, so you do need a US-based supervisor. Yep.
And also, there's no issue in regards to if it is a relative. And could you please talk a little bit about the e-verification that the business needs to acquire?
Yeah, so E-Verify is a federal program that once employers participate in it, it's a way they can check all their employees' work authorization documents. So it's a way to verify that your employee is authorized to work in the United States. I think Odysseus, as you mentioned, it's very easy to sign up for E-Verify. Now, once you've signed up for E-Verify, you are signing up that you will run all of your employees through that system moving forward. So it's not something you can sign up for one person and then not use for anybody else. They are signing up to use for everybody. Now, one question I often get asked from Davidson students and others is they're working for a small company that's not E-Verified. You have no ownership. It's just a small family-owned company. You're trying to get STEM OPT and the company says, well, we don't have E-Verify. Is it hard for them to get? No, it's very easy. In North Carolina, actually, once you're over 25 employees under state law, you have to use E-Verify. So in North Carolina, once you're over 25, if you're not using it, there's compliance issues under state law. But I think the one thing that not a caveat, but just make sure the company knows is once they sign up for E-Verify, they have to use it on all new employees moving forward. So it's not something they can sign up for you and then not use again. They are signing up to use it for all new hires moving forward. But it's very simple. I mean, the application probably takes about an hour at most. There's no fee to do it. So there's no cost, for the business says, what does it cost me? There's no cost. So for those of you that go on STEM OPT and have an employer that is hesitant to do it, again, there's no cost to it. It's a fairly simple application process. And again, if you're going to be in North Carolina, you can even tell them, well, by the way, in North Carolina, once you hit 25 employees, you have to use it. So the sooner they start using it, frankly, the better.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's transition to the e-visa, because I think that especially, that is the visa when someone calls me and says, I want to create a U.S. business, whether they're in school or out of school, that's the visa I think too. The e-visa, and this is E as an elephant, is based on a treaty or treaties that the U.S. has with certain countries. So I think the first thing to think about is you have to be a citizen of a country that we have a treaty with. And if you're not from a country that we have a treaty with, unfortunately, the e-visa is not an option for you. And let me put in the chat, look up there's a list. The list, just anecdotally, is a lot of countries from Western Europe have treaties. Not all, but many from Western Europe have treaties. Not a lot of countries from Asia have treaties. So for example, China and India, there's no e-visa treaty for. But there are some countries that are surprising. Let me just pull up and then I'll put it in the chat. But you do have to you have to have citizenship from one of these countries. So if you, for example, if you have an Indian passport, an e-visa is just not an option, just because it's all based on the treaties that the US has. Just put it in the chat. But let's say you're from a country, and let me just pull up make sure I'm saying this correctly. And actually, this is good. So let's say you're from Greece, just as an example. So we do have a treaty with Greece, but it's not so. And there's two types of investor visas. There's traditional investor visas, which are E2 visas, and then there's investor trader visas, which are E1 visas, and they're distinct visas. So Greece, for example, has a treaty for an investor trader, but they don't have a treaty for the traditional investor visa. So if you were from Greece and you wanted to come open a Greek restaurant in the United States on a treaty visa or an investor visa, I would say you can't because we don't have that treaty. Now, if you were a Greek person that wanted to open a business, an import business where you imported olive oil or Greek food that you sold to Greek restaurants, that is a treaty, or excuse me, that's a trader visa. So you could get a visa there because you're importing and trading from your home country. So that's an important distinction sometimes. It's not often, but Greece is an example. And there's a couple others where you have to look exactly what the treaty between the US and your country allows. Now, Germany, for example, has both. So if you're a German citizen that wants to come open a US business, either you're importing German goods from Germany to sell in the United States, or you just want to run your own business, you can do that based on the treaty with Germany. Now, if you're doing the true investor visa, you do have to show that you personally put a significant amount of investment into the US business. That amount of money is not defined. So there's no minimum level of investment for this visa. I always tell people a good number that looks good for the visa application is 100,000 US dollars. But again, that's not an absolute minimum. I've done as low as 55,000 US dollars, and I've heard of people doing even as low as 30,000 US dollars. You do have to show that whatever type of business you're running, the amount of money you invested is appropriate for that type of business in that location, so that if you got the visa, you'd be able to open the business right away. So basically, you have to have invested enough in the business that if the visa is approved, you'd be able to open doors and start operating right away. So just for an example, if you wanted to run a restaurant, then what the embassy is going to be looking for is, do you have a physical space? Do you have equipment on hand? Do you have supplies already ordered? If you're running a consulting, like an IT consulting agency, then physical space is not as important. Then they're going to look, well, do you have equipment purchased? Do you have computer equipment? Do you have a website, up and running? So each business type, they're going to look at what is appropriate for that type of business. But either way, you do have to show that you personally invested your funds into the US business. One question I've often been asked is, well, what if my parents gave me the money to set up the business? Is that permitted? Yes, but the caveat there is you do have to show that you had the money at some point. So for example, if your parents transferred the money directly from their bank account to the US business account, the US government's going to say it was never your money. It's your parents who invested, not you. So your parents have to give you the money, so they transfer it to your bank account, and then you put it in the US business. Some people don't like this because it creates tax issues, which is true, but unfortunately for the visa purposes, that's what's required. And Odysseus, see a question.
What if, let's say, somebody wins the Nisbet competition, which is a $25,000 award for 5% equity here at Davidson? Would that count towards getting a visa sponsorship, or would that not count towards that?
Yeah, so good. So for the E visa, if you're getting the true investor visa, you have to be, either you or citizens of your country have to own a majority of the stock. So if you only own 5%, you don't own a majority of the company to get the investor visa. So again, if you're from Germany, you have to show either you or German citizens own at least 51% of the company's stock for it to be eligible for the investor visa. Now, I think to your question, Odysseus, if you are a 5% owner in a business, can that business sponsor you for another work visa? Yes, that's possible. For example, they could sponsor you for an H-1B or an O visa or some others. But as far as the true investor visa, either you or people, citizens of your country, have to own a majority of the stock. And so I've had this come up where people, you go in with a group of friends from Davidson, some are Americans, some are international students. You do have to structure it so that the international students own the majority of the shares. It's just that can be delicate sometimes, but that for the investor visa, that's what required. You do have to show the majority are owned by citizens of your country. And Omar.
Hey, so I was thinking, are these rules the same for online businesses?
So I guess, what do you mean by online businesses?
Like, let's say there's a business of e-commerce, right? Like you mentioned Amazon selling, right?
Mhm.
If a person has an LLC registered, like he wants to register an LLC and run an online business under that, and an online business doesn't require you to be physically present in the US. Like you can go anywhere while working with it. So,
Correct.
but to own that business bank account, I think you would require like a LLC and the visa and all those documents. So do these rules apply for that?
Yeah, good question. So, and this is where immigration and tax and sort of get intertwined and complicated, and they don't always agree with each other. So, for example, if you owned an online business that sold on Amazon and you really didn't live in the United States, do you need an investor visa? No. You'd need a visitor visa if you wanted to just come check up on your business. However, some banks will not allow you to have a business account unless somebody has a social security number, or somebody has work authorization. So it's not an immigration rule, it's an internal bank rule. And so this is where sometimes you have to talk to multiple banks about, well, what is your policy about, about the business bank account and who the contact is? Because again, it's not a law, but I know many banks, and it has more to do with their reporting obligations to the IRS about potential, terrorism and things like that. So they basically, they're protecting themselves by saying, we will not allow a business to operate a bank account with us unless we have somebody who has a social security number and has a visa. But is that a law? No, absolutely not. So that's why I think if you get that answer from a bank, my immediate reaction is, we'll talk to another bank first and see if their rules are different.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Could I ask for some clarification, please? So earlier you said that the major amount of the company needs to be owned by the individual who's an international student. So specifically, let's say that I get the $25,000 from Davidson, and Davidson gets 5% of my company, meaning that I have 95% of the company left. Can I share essentially my business percentage of 95% with another Greek student, where we're both going to have the ultimate percentage of the business, and sponsor with 30 to 100K, which means $5,000 to $75,000 extra on top of the grant, sponsor both of the green cards for one business?
Yeah, so, and we're not talking about green cards yet, because green card is different. So, but for the e-visa, yes, that could work. So if you're both Greek, and again, at least 51% of the shares are owned by Greek citizens, you could each get Greek visas, or get e-visas through the treaty. Because for the e-visa, you either get a visa as the primary investor or as a senior manager. So for example, Odysseus, if you were the primary investor, you are the majority owner, I'd probably say you should apply for the visa as the primary investor. And then your majority, if you have another Greek citizen who owns 10% or 20%, I would have them apply not as the investor, but as just a manager. But because they're still Greek and it's a Greek company, they could get the e-visa that way. I will talk about green cards in a minute, because green card sponsorship is different. The e-visa is nice because it's temporary, in the sense that you're in the US for the purpose of running your visa, but it can be renewed indefinitely. So you can renew an e-visa every it's usually 4 or 5 years. I have clients that have been on e-visas for 25 years. For example, I have a British client that owns a Subway up by UNC Charlotte, and they've been here for 25 years, and they just renew their visa every 5 years because their Subway restaurant is still operating. So the e-visa is temporary in the sense that it expires, but unlike the H-1B and some other visas that have a hard time limit, the e-visa can be renewed over and over again.
Thank you.
Okay. And I think this segues well to green card, just because I know that's sort of obviously you get an investor visa and you've been here for 5 years, 10 years, like my client, 25 years. Often you think, well, I live here now, I want to stay here. Can I get a green card? So generally, so for the normal, I guess even to back up, let me back up even further. There are 5 ways in the United States and only 5 to get a green card. Fairly simple, but it can be frustrating. Number 1 is family. And just for context, 70% of all green cards are given away through family-based immigration. So the vast majority, when you think, well, how do most people in the US get a green card? 70% are through family. The 20% are through company-sponsored green cards. Where, Bank of America, Deloitte, Wells Fargo, they, Google, Facebook, they sponsor people for green cards. Now, for employment-based green card, you can have a small percentage of ownership. So like Facebook, for example, sometimes they give their employees stock as part of their pay options. Having a small percentage of stock does not prohibit Facebook from sponsoring you for a green card. However, if you have a pretty significant ownership share, you're not allowed to sponsor yourself for a green card through that route, through the traditional company-based route. So there is that sort of caveat, is that, again, if you're the majority shareholder on an e-visa, you generally cannot do the traditional green card, company-based green card route. And again, what it boils down to is there's no employer-employee relationship. They want an employer-employee relationship for that type of green card process. So then what does that leave you with? The two that really aren't applicable for you all would be if you apply for a green card as an asylum or refugee. There's a green card lottery. I don't know if you've heard of the diversity visa lottery that happens every year. You can try now as a student. In fact, I encourage you, there's no harm to do so. The lottery opens once a year, and actually in October, so it's opening soon. But it's a very small percentage of people that get in that way, but it doesn't hurt to try. And then the last way to get a green card is the investment-based green card, which is different than the investor visa. There are people that do both, but it is a different criteria. And I'll just say the difficulty, and it is with the investor-based green card, is the level of investment is much, much more. We're talking about $1.5 million investment into your US business. There are a couple exceptions, but generally the rule is, over $1 million of investment, and you have to create 10 US jobs. The e-visa, that temporary investor visa, again, there's no minimum threshold, but even let's just say you did 100,000, you also don't have a minimum threshold of US jobs. You need to create some US jobs, but there's no strict number. The investor-based green card, it's called the EB-5 green card, that requires that $1 million+ investment and creating 10 US jobs. So it's a pretty big difference, between the two. And so that sort of sometimes is the issue, is that like my client that owns the subway, they haven't invested, that much money. They don't have that many employees either, full-time employees. And so they haven't been able to pursue a green card because they can't sponsor themselves through the traditional route. They're not eligible through the EB-5 route. Now, one green card route that has become I don't want to say popular, but has become more noticed with entrepreneurs in the last couple of years, is called the NIW, the National Interest Waiver Green Card. And it's become popular also for people that have STEM degrees, but it does allow you to self-sponsor for a green card. Whether you own your own business or whether you just sort of have a hypothetical business, but you do have to show, and I wouldn't say prove, but you have to reasonably convince an immigration officer that your plan for either your business or your job in the United States has national importance and impact, and it can be indirect, but sort of national importance and impact, and that you're well positioned to advance that yourself in your field. So one example with entrepreneurs is if you can show that, hey, look, I've got a lot of investors interested into my business, across the United States. You can show, look, this has national interest. People are looking, into investing because they love my idea. Here's what my idea can do. For example, if you develop an app that someone I've heard of, she developed an app that helped monitor for people that had seizures. It was a way that it was like almost like a Fitbit that would warn you that, hey, your symptoms of seizures are coming along. She was able to get an NIW green card because she was able to say, look, if I'm successful, this is going to have a national impact across the United States. And I've got all these US citizens looking to invest in my business once I get here. So there are ways for entrepreneurs to get an NIW green card, but you really have to think about and have a good plan for what your business is going to do. Just owning a restaurant, by itself probably is not enough for an NIW because they won't have that national impact. But for the right person, absolutely, an NIW could be a creative way to sponsor yourself after you get your investor visa without having to put in the $1.5 million level.
Could I ask a question regarding the NIW, did you say? Is there a specific cost that you need to have, like a specific amount of dollars invested, or is it just?
No, and it's very nebulous. So it's good and it's bad because there's no minimum investment. So you don't have to worry about that. But because it's so nebulous, the government can sort of use, it's very subjective. It's hard to say you have a slam dunk case because the officer can interpret things differently. But to your point, Odysseus, no. And I think you'd have to explain if you have a lower level of investment, why it's not needed or why you can still succeed. But to your point, no, you don't have to have it on hand to be successful for the NIW.
And lastly, I want to ask, from my research, I found out that specifically for the green card that you can get, where you mentioned earlier that you have to have invested approximately $1 million and have 10 US jobs available. Are there any specific locations in the US where they need to increase employment in the area? So I think you get the question that I want.
Yes. So there is an exception to that over $1 million investment and it's called a TEA, a targeted employment area. And so it's areas of the United States that there are needs for more jobs. And so the level of investment is less. It used to be $500,000, and now I think it's about 800,000 if I remember the new figures. So it's less than $1 million if you're willing to invest in this area. Now, I will say the other thing about the TEAs, the targeted employment areas, obviously many of them are in rural areas, but not all. You'd be surprised. So what the definition of a targeted employment area? So for example, in Charlotte, if you're opening a business in South Park, that's not going to be in targeted employment area. But it would not surprise me, for example, if Mooresville is a targeted employment area. So if you open your business in Mooresville, but you want to live in Charlotte, that's fine because it matters where your business is. So there's ways to think about, you can look at, and actually I will send the link. You can look at the targeted employment areas. Again, there a lot of them are rural areas, but there are more in urban areas than you would think, especially because they can define sort of a subset of an urban area, because Mooresville is practically part of Charlotte. But again, if the TEA has been designated, you could open your business there and then live in Charlotte and still be compliant. It's still a lot of money. It's still not insignificant. But I think, Odysseus, your question, it's less than $1 million, and certainly or less than 1.5 million. So for some people, it's more doable.
Thank you so much for answering the question.
And so that's sort of everything I had planned to talk about. At this point, again, I really just want to open it up for questions that people have about anything I've talked about.
I had a question. Something I was researching about was you can get an H-1B visa without the lottery, and I think it's to do with if you go into a job with healthcare, you don't need to enter the lottery. Could you speak a little bit about that and then potentially how you could go from an H-1B onto a green card if that's possible? Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. I will say I will plug, and I think Sarah in the office I'll be coming up in February to talk about this a little more in detail. But I'm happy to talk about it now. But I'll be on campus in February to talk about H-1B, sort of all that, and do one-on-one meetings. But yeah, I think to your question, Abdullah, so you're right. Many companies have to go through the H-1B lottery. There are some exceptions for nonprofits that are affiliated with a university. And many hospitals are nonprofits, not all. So that is important. It does have to be a nonprofit healthcare institution. So for example, here in Charlotte, though, both Presbyterian or Novant and Atrium are nonprofit institutions. Those nonprofit institutions do have to have relationships with the university. Anecdotally, almost every hospital, it's a nonprofit, does, because they have medical student, interns and things like that. But so, for example, if you wanted to work for Atrium, they could file an H-1B for you without having to go through the lottery. So that's a huge benefit. You'll be on a cap exempt H-1B. And then from the H-1B, Atrium could sponsor you for a green card. You'd have to do the normal employment base where Atrium sponsors you. They have to advertise the job to show they've tried to find a US worker. So they do the normal employment-based route. So being a nonprofit only gets you the H-1B easier. It doesn't make the green card really that much easier. It's the same sort of normal process for the green card. The only exception I will say to the green card rules is if you happen to be in, I think for you all as Davidson students, it probably wouldn't be the case. But if you're a nurse or a physical therapist, the US government has expedited green card processes for nurses and physical therapists just because of the shortage. So if you were graduated with a degree in nursing and got a job offer, you could get a green card faster because of the special provisions. But certainly, I think to your question, getting an H-1B through a nonprofit hospital or also teaching, a lot of teaching jobs qualify for cap exempt because most schools are nonprofit. You certainly can get a work visa without having to deal with the stress of the H-1B lottery.
Thank you. I had one more question. So you talked a lot about opening businesses within the US. What would be like the regulations if I was to open a business outside the US as a student?
Good question. And I want Sarah to chime in here because I always tell people the Immigration Service, when you're in the United States, obviously they care about what you're doing. Now, if you open a business, let's say back in your home country, and you make money and you put that money into your foreign bank account, I think there's an argument that that is fine and that you have not violated your student status. And also I think that would avoid tax obligations. But Sarah, do you disagree? Or it's gray. It's gray because but I feel like what's important to me is that the money needs to stay in a foreign bank account. You shouldn't be sending it to your US account.
Will, thanks for sharing that. I, as a newer immigration advisor, am going to encourage you, if that's a specific situation, you have to schedule a meeting with Angie and Sarah so that since they've got a little bit more experience, I'll speak to that. Sorry, my dogs are barking. But I don't want to give you false advice. So,
but I mean, I think I'll to your question, is it possible? Yes, but I think you have to be very careful about how you structure it. Because I think especially if the money is coming into a US bank account, that starts to look like even though the business is abroad, you're doing the work here. So I think that, again, it's gray and there might be a way to tease it out, but I think either way, you'd want to be very thoughtful how you do it.
I think they talk about this in one of the pre-orientations. Like you can't earn money from any kind of business, even if it's in your home country.
Yeah, I mean, that's the safest. I mean, obviously that is the safest if you wanted to be the most conservative. That's true. I mean, when you go home for break, obviously when you're not in the United States, the US government, there's no regulations that control you. So when you go home for the summer, you can do what you want because you're not in the United States. But when you are here, to that point, you just have to be careful because, again, if you're running the business online from your computer at night from your dorm room, you're doing activities that are generating revenue in the United States. And so I think that's where the line starts to get, you're pushing the line a little bit. But again, if you own a business that's abroad and, someone else while you're in school is running it for you, but you're getting a check as the owner, I think that's different.
Hey, this reminds me, if you have a business in another country and like the revenue of that business goes to that country's bank account and nothing comes in this US bank account, right? And it all started before you like even come to the US. Does it count as like history when you like apply for visas or green card or whatever? Like, because I know like there's this whole history that is checked, right? So does that count in that? Like if nothing is coming in the US and none of that is happening.
Well, so I think that's where, to my point, they might start asking questions about, well, were you running the business while you were in school? Were you sending emails at night telling people to fulfill orders, because then the government would say, well, then you were working, even though the money was earned abroad, you were still doing activities in the United States that earned money. But you know, if it was more, I was the owner, and when I was home, I was involved, but when I was in school, you know, my uncle ran it or my cousin, I think that's different. But I think you've got to think about because that's what the government is going to want to know, is what were you doing while you were here in the United States for that business? And if the answer was, you know, not much, again, you know, you got an update once a quarter on what was going on and got on a Zoom call, I think that's not working. But if you're answering emails every night, telling people what to do, that's running the business.
All right. Thank you.
Other questions?
I had a question about the family section of the green card. You said 70% of people get a green card through family. So
Yep.
what extent does family go to? Like, is that just parents, like siblings, or can that be like cousins or extended family, like aunts and uncles, etc.?
Good question. And the short answer is it is close family members. So those that can sponsor you are your spouse, your children, if your children are 21, which obviously for you that wouldn't apply yet, but your spouse, your parents, your brother and sister, and that's really it. So it really is close family members. And I will say, different categories have different quotas. So for example, if one of you has a brother that's a US citizen, and I had this question from a Davidson student, said, oh, my brother was born here, can my brother sponsor me? Yes, when your brother turns 18, he can sponsor you, but brothers and sisters of US citizens have a quota, and they can only give so many green cards in that category per year. And because of the backlog, the estimated wait time for a brother and sister of a US citizen to get a green card is at minimum 15 years. So it's not, you know, depending on the relationship, it's not quick. Now, and I don't mean this to be funny, but I mean, just the reality is when people say, well, out of that 70%, then you know, how are most people getting their green card? It's through marriage. I mean, that's just to be, you know, that's the reality, is that most of those people within that 70%, they're getting their green card because their spouse is either a citizen or a green card holder. So even within that 70%, I'd probably say over 50 to 60% within that 70 are getting their green card through marriage. Right.
I think that's all what we're going to cover today. I want to give the stage a little bit to Victoria to say something specific in regards to the Entrepreneurship Club, and then we're going to do the closings.
Okay, thank you so much, William, for this session. It was very informative. Thank you, everybody who attended. I just wanted to bring to you guys' attention that if you are a domestic student and you are considering business formation or just learning more how to like create a business in the US, the Heart Hub will be hosting a class on the 23rd of October from 7 to 8. And so feel free to, you know, drop by and learn something. I'm going to post in the chat the link to the event, and you can RSVP. It's also on Wildcat Sync. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for saying that. I also want to thank you, Mr. Hummel, for going over with the presentation that we had scheduled for today, and putting all this work and effort and collecting all this information to let our fabulous international students and US students know about what they're going to need to do in order to open a business. I believe that all of this information was really helpful for a lot of us, and I think a lot of minds will be working at the end of the day, today night, and figuring out what they're going to have to do. So with that said, thank you very much for being here, and we hope we get to see you on February on campus.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't have my contact information, Odysseus, you can give it to anybody that wants it, or Sarah in the International Student Office have it again. Whether you're US or international, please, as a Davidson alum, email me. For international students in particular, there's no cost for you to talk to me. So please see me as a resource. If you have a particular situation to talk one-on-one, that's what I'm here for.
Would you like to share your information on the chat so everybody has it available?
Sure. Let me I'll just put and email is usually the easiest way to reach me. So I'll put my email right here. And again, I'll be up in February, and we'll do one-on-one meetings then. But if anyone, especially seniors, as I know you're already thinking about post-graduation, if you want to reach out to me, please feel free.
Okay, I think we're all good. Thank you very much again. We hope we get to see you in February.
Yes. Thank you all. All right. Have a good weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Did you like the event, Sarah?
Yes, thanks so much for letting me join. I took lots of notes, so I'll share it with the rest of the ISE team. I appreciate you including us.
Yeah, no problem. I hope more people would have joined, but I guess 18 people is good enough at this point.
Yeah, and you've got a recording that you can use
Yeah.
as a moving forward too.
Stop the